I'm supposed to push the button. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and welcome to those of you who are joining us electronically. When we left off just prior to lunch, we were in the section considering those recommendations pertaining to responsible stewardship, and we were on recommendations 4, 5, 6, and 7. In other words, the first 4 in responsible stewardship, and we have a couple more to consider there. And I think the next person in order to speak with us is Nelson Michael. Nelson.
Thank you, sir. So our discussions at the first meeting were supported by some number of individuals that had come to testify before this commission in terms of their experience with similar topics and challenges with synthetic biology and some of its antecedent technologies, like nanotechnologies, from countries other than the United States. And I think that one clear conclusion that we heard as commissioners from those groups was to remind us that we are embedded in a global community and that our deliberation should be taken within that context. So if any of you have a teenager at home, you know that they'll log on to something like a PlayStation 3, and within a few minutes they're engaged in some pursuits that my wife considers not to be wholesome, but my 15-year-old would disagree. And he's doing these kinds of pursuits with people all around the world. We mean, truly our community is global, and these issues that we have been debating for the past several months transcend borders. The question really for us to struggle with is, how does an American government deliberative body that is advising our government, how do we put that into context? So I think that and it's easy to simply pay lip service to the fact that, yes, we are in a global community and we should pay attention to those stakeholders that are engaged in these pursuits and move on from there. But I think that we need to really give a lot of thought to this concept, because it really makes little sense for us as a deliberative body to simply debate and to advise our own government in a vacuum. So I'll give you another personal anecdote. About 2 weeks ago, I was in the southern African country of Mozambique. This is an area of the world that has an underappreciated HIV epidemic. My group is largely engaged in making vaccines for HIV infection, with some recent success last year in Thailand. Next steps for my field is to look at populations that are most at risk for HIV infection. That would include women, especially women in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as men who have sex with men in Southeast Asia, and eventually in Europe and the United States. So as part of a preliminary trip to the Maputo area, this is the first time I had been to the country of Mozambique, I was immediately struck by the fact that their Ministry of Health had a intramural research group was superb. Oldest person in that group is 37 years old. This country has just recently emerged from a very long civil war, so most of their effective scientists were relatively young. They were young, they were hungry, they were aggressive, they had built a wonderful research platform, and they were looking for support. We had partnered as the United States government with the Mozambican government to pursue the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, and there was a very, very large U.S. government presence, largely led by the Centers for Disease Control, DHHS, and USAID, obviously all under the aegis of our ambassador. And after a week of very good meetings, I traveled with my colleagues from the University of California, San Diego, who were interested in starting these research activities yesterday. The USAID had funded Family Health International to do some HIV incidence work in a town called Chokwe, but to our disappointment, that study was really underfunded. FHI knew it, but they just didn't have the funds. And the government of Mozambique really wanted us to engage by increasing the size of the study and its power, which is something that we aim to do. However, we spent a large part of that week that we were there, and in multiple emails since then, discussing what the impact of us starting this new activity would be on other activities that the Ministry of Health of Mozambique are doing, and what impact this would have with us essentially engaging some of the best and brightest researchers in that country that are also engaged in the execution of delivery of care and treatment through PEPFAR, which is saving Mozambican lives every day. So the CDC and AID representatives sat with me, with the ambassador, and we debated these concepts. And I brought these back then to the government of Mozambique about 3 or 4 hours later. So the point is that I think we probably will move forward there. It makes good sense. But there needs to be a very deliberative process of open debate. That what one group may think makes a lot of sense may actually interdict the good works of others. And in the end result, much dialogue and mutual respect has to be in place in order for any endeavor in synthetic biology and its promises and estimates of its risks and how we deal with those challenges needs to be put in that context. So let me then move on to recommendation number 8 from the committee. Recognizing that biosafety and biosecurity are best assured through international coordination, the Department of State, in collaboration with other relevant agencies such as the Department of Health and Human Services, should engage appropriate parties in the international setting to foster ongoing dialogue in this field. And as I read this recommendation again this morning, I must say I don't think I remembered it when I was in Mozambique, but it really struck me how relevant this was to a real life experience that I had just experienced. And I think that this will probably resonate for us as we go forward to ensure that we look at a proper global framework for synthetic biology.
I am. Thank you.
For the people in the electronic audience, Christine Grady will present our next recommendation.
Thank you. So our next discussion under the topic of responsible stewardship has to do with creating a culture of responsibility. So we all know that responsible conduct of science, including synthetic biology but not limited to it, certainly rests heavily on the behavior of scientists. And a culture of responsibility and accountability for actions must be fostered at the local level. The scientists need to be aware of ethical standards, ethical practices, safety standards, biosecurity standards, etc. And scientists are usually in a position to be the first to notice and respond to suspicious behaviors of various types. So the recommendation that we've been working on addresses the need to create and foster a culture of responsibility. Now, interestingly, and not surprisingly to anybody, it's very hard to legislate or regulate a culture of responsibility. So this recommendation focuses on education. And it takes the position that currently federally funded researchers, anyway, are required to have certain kinds of education and training associated with their research. They have training in the responsible conduct of research, protection of human subjects, and the use and protection of laboratory animals. Also biosafety and security when working with select agents and other related trainings. Researchers working within institutions and with recombinant DNA, for example, are also very aware that they have to undergo review by institutional biosafety committees before they can begin their research. And researchers that do research with human subjects are aware that they have to have review by institutional review boards before they do research with human subjects. And they learn this through the courses that they take and the mentoring that they have in their respective institutions. So in synthetic biology, there are some interesting challenges in this regard. The first is that there are many new actors within the institution, so people outside of the biological sciences, engineers, chemists, material scientists, computer modelers, and others for whom federally funded work has not required any kind of ethics training or education. In addition, there are scientists that are outside of the conventional research settings, outside of the biological research settings, and including, but again not limited to, the do-it-yourselfers who are out there doing research in the community. There are also scientists in the private sector who are not do not have to comply with federally funded requirements for research ethics training and biosafety training. And then, as we've heard, and Nelson had a wonderful anecdote, which I can't supply one for, but we have international collaboration and an international network of scientists that work together in research. So what we hope to recommend here is that there be some required education for all of the researchers in the field of synthetic biology. So I'm going to read the recommendation, the provisional recommendation, and then make one or two more comments. The recommendation says, required ethics education, similar to the training required today in the medical and clinical research communities, should be developed for all researchers, including student researchers outside the medical setting, such as engineering, material science, information technology. The Executive Office of the President coordinating body referenced above, as referenced earlier in our discussion, in consultation with the National Academy of Sciences, should convene a panel to consider appropriate training requirements and models. And I think that the recommendation to have a panel look at appropriate training requirements and models is extremely important because although there is education required, training requirements for biological scientists, there is still quite a bit of variability in what those programs look like. There are not agreed upon anyway standards for what the content should be, and so and probably the content of the programs that do exist is not going to be exactly right for the wider reach of this outreach for scientists in bio and synthetic biology. I think secondly, it would be helpful for us to think about not only having this panel think about what the appropriate training requirements and models are, but also thinking about how to make them publicly, widely available so that people who are do-it-yourselfers have access to these kinds of training programs without a lot of effort.
Christine, thank you. This actually is a place for a break in our presentation so we can have some conversation. These were the last two, you recall, of a total of, I believe, 6 recommendations made in that area of responsible stewardship. Any comments on, actually we fold these into the others we've spoken about, but any comments first specifically on these recommendations for international coordination and also for education? Dan?
I was glad to hear that Nelson had actually forgotten about number 8 because I, as you know from this morning's conversation, had also forgotten it was there. But it strikes me that maybe one of the reasons that's the case is when you read it, it seems a little tepid and tentative. And I wonder if, while I don't want to make a substantive change in it, whether we shouldn't somehow strengthen this. So, for instance, saying what the goal of the dialogue might be, where we heading, looking to see whether there might be others involved besides the State Department and DHHS in looking at engaging in an international dialogue. Because I think it is really critical. We heard that from a lot of people, and I'd just like to see it a little highlighted more than it is in the current form.
Focus of dialogue, what would you suggest?
Well, I think we're looking probably toward having where we can have agreement on actual standards for some of these things, and that it's not obviously there will be differences internationally, but to the extent that we can have uniform expectations throughout the world, given the way science is globalized, both on the safety and on the biosecurity efforts, I think that it would be helpful to say that that's where we were really moving.
Yeah, this is, in some sense, an unprecedented opportunity for a President's Commission to proactively get maximum agreement on the international level, because in most cases, presidential commissions have taken up issues of what standards should be after a science is very far along and developed. And in this case, synthetic biology is in its adolescence, if not infancy. And I think that presents the opportunity in our recommendation about international collaboration, a realistic opportunity of getting quite a bit of agreement. Now, we don't know until we try, but I think the idea is that we, at minimum, should engage the World Health Organization, which is representative of, is the major organization on the international scene with regard to health. And other of our counterparts of commissions
Of whom we'll hear tomorrow.
We'll hear tomorrow, and we've already reached out and had meetings with them most recently this past meetings that, the meetings we've had and engaged them, and also this summer the international organization of all bioethics commissions met, and we were represented there. So I think, Dan, you're right. We should specifically mention WHO and also other, make sure we engage other organizations on the international level.
I'm like Dan. I'm imagining so what? Is there a way that this kind of thing could be woven into the other this particular recommendation for international consideration should be woven in more broadly into the other recommendations that we have, meaning that when we are asking for policy or process, that we suggest that be in harmony with, or at least in the with the awareness of what's happening internationally, as opposed to pulling it out as a separate. Do all these things, and then, oh, by the way, we ought to be talking across the oceans. Actually, I think Nita was up, and then Dan.
So I think I agree with you, Jim, on maybe folding into some of the other ones. So looking ahead, for example, to number 13, we have something quite specific about export controls, just sort of previewing it and thinking about dialoguing with international communities about that, as well as scientists. It seems like this biosecurity concern, this is just one of several of the biosecurity concerns. So I'm not sure that it is a standalone recommendation unless we strengthen it to be something unique, like trying to come up with international standards of practice or international standards of biosafety.
Dan?
I think that's my suggestion, that it be more a both and than either or. We do also in number 4, for instance, stay abreast of international developments. So there are places where we're already mentioning the international, but I think to strengthen what we're saying and to say specifically that we have an aim of trying to get maximal agreement internationally would be worth a standalone recommendation.
There is a difference, and whether we have it as a standalone recommendation or not, I'm agnostic on, but there is a difference with biosecurity, what's at stake with biosecurity and what's at stake with, for example, realizing the benefits or the just distribution of benefits. With biosecurity, any high risk, however low probability, any lack of precaution against the high risk, low probability events by any actor globally affects everybody. Whereas some of the other places we call for international collaboration, it would be great if we got it, but if we don't, you don't lose everything by that. You lose an awful lot when biosafety and particularly biosecurity we don't have international standards. I think we will, the U.S. is likely, given past experience, to be both a leader here and not, I suspect we will get a lot of agreement on this internationally. But I just wanted to underline that this particular recommendation under responsible stewardship, which deals with biosecurity, is of a higher order of importance than some of the other parts of international agreement.
Okay, I'll hold my tongue. I like the way, as you help us separate the thoughts between biosecurity and biosafety, I see the international, I see us converging more readily on the biosecurity issues than I do on some of the biosafety issues, given the precautionary stance of Europe, for example, relative to what we're advocating. And we might want to just fess up on that and say that we're especially interested in or especially recommend these sort of joint activities, international activities around biosecurity. Nita and then John.
Jim, I agree with you. So listening to what Amy was saying, I didn't understand that to be the point of this particular recommendation. And if that is the point of this recommendation, if we're looking at biosafety from a biosecurity perspective and trying to get buy-in from an international community, I think we could reword this and focus it to say what we're really interested in is not just the general how safe is your lab for, your workers in your particular laboratory environment, but we're talking about it for this recommendation purposes. We're talking about it for international standards with respect to security.
Security especially. Yeah.
Just as far as what we might anticipate, we will be, in all likelihood, we don't know this for sure, but in all likelihood, more libertarian with regard to some issues of what science should be able to do, given our previous principle of prudent vigilance and saying that we're not fully on the precautionary principle side. Whereas with biosecurity, I think we'll all be in harmony.
I agree.
And I think we all believe that that's the most important thing to be in harmony
Yeah,
on.
I agree.
John?
Just one small point here. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, so this is just a bit of wordsmithing. Instead of saying best assured, I think we might want to say something a bit stronger, like, international cooperation is essential or indispensable
for biosecurity.
Yeah.
In biosecurity.
But I wanted to ask Christine a question about the education item here. Chris, what is your impression of the quality of most ethics education regarding clinical and research, issues out there? I know that at the NIH, you folks do an amazingly good job equipped with a textbook that you and I wrote. But
will there be signings this afternoon?
yeah, a bargain at any price, available on Amazon.com.
And there is a question here, right?
I don't have a lot to do now with hands-on medical education, but I hear a lot of grumbling about these sorts of requirements and how they're not really all that substantive and how the educational programs are not really all that demanding or helpful. So I'm wondering about the wisdom here of hitching our recommendation to the current level of training that we see out there in clinical and research ethics.
So, of course, you're right, John. There's huge variability in terms of the quality of courses that are out there, which is why I made friendly amendments to the recommendation as I read it. You may not have noticed, but for example, the comparable I took out. I don't think that makes any sense. And I added at the end, in not only thinking about the models that might work, but thinking about the content. Because I do think, there is responsible conduct of research. There are modules that people use across a variety of types of labs, and I think maybe those are good models to look at. But then there's huge variability beyond that. And so the question is, what specific do people who are scientists who are involved in synthetic biology really need to think about and know about in order to be responsible for their research? I think a very important part of this, though, and hopefully I stressed it, is that, who is reached by the courses that are currently available, whether they grumble about them or not, are people who are required to take them because they're federally funded. And in this particular arena, we have to be really aware of the number of actors in different settings, of different disciplines and different countries that don't have access to the information that we think might be important for people to think about when they're trying to be responsible scientists. And so that's why I think thinking carefully about not only the venue, the content, but also as publicly available as possible.
Barbara had a quick comment, and then maybe we'll go out to the audience.
And it was to Chris's, and it's just what you ended with, that this made me realize
Barbara, is your microphone?
No, thanks. Sorry. This made me realize this education piece, that we talked a lot about public education, but we really don't have a recommendation, I believe, about public education, but maybe modules of ethics education aimed at the general public, not just at scientists, but really some more public education maybe needs to be seen throughout our recommendations, but this one in particular.
I think that we do have one on public education, as you know, coming up, but I think here we should just say we have to take advantage of online education modules, because there are audiences that won't be reached otherwise. And we can't that's why this is under a culture of responsibility. We can't ensure 100% coverage, but we sure can make it possible by having online resources. And I wouldn't emphasize the ideal education, which we may not reach, but I don't think we can.
In spite of having ideal textbooks.
Right, in spite of having ideal textbooks, I think some of the basic ethics education here, which is non-existent, and we heard from somebody at MIT that the engineers who are working in this field, the students don't have to do any ethics education. And that's just unacceptable from the perspective of any kind of responsible stewardship.
I think it's a solid recommendation. Are there comments or questions out of the audience, the public? Seeing none, let's move on. The next framing ethics area for us is intellectual freedom and responsibility. And you heard Dr. Gutman, President Gutman, review this earlier. The need that to ensure that we have an environment with sufficient but not onerous regulation in order that we foster rather than squelch the creative spirit of scientists, scientists and technology developers. We have several recommendations in this category, and the first one, Nelson, I think you're back on. Oh, no, you're not. Anita's on. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So with number 10, we are officially halfway through. This recommendation actually has two parts to it. The first part recommends that the government support a continued culture of responsibility, which I'm going to interpret as individual and corporate responsibility, and self-regulation, and that we do this by and with the scientific community in collaboration with NIH and with NIH guidelines, as well as with other mechanisms for monitoring and enhancing watchfulness. And the second part, beyond the underscoring of the importance of culture of responsibility, is oversight. And here the recommendation is that acting through a central coordinating office, such as the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the government should evaluate current oversight mechanisms to assess their effectiveness and determine what, if any, additional steps should be taken to foster accountability at the institutional level without limiting intellectual freedom. Now, as an academic, I am extremely self-conscious about the importance of academic freedom, but mindful as an ethicist of the importance of ethical responsibility, which sometimes requires both oversight and accountability. This morning, President Wagner stressed the Commission's underlying assumption that we do want to promote research. Research can lead to innovative processes and products. And as I said before, in connection with my presentation of the Commission's third recommendation, innovation, and in particular biomedical innovation, often benefits the public. Well, innovation doesn't always benefit the public, even when it overtakes whole ways of life. We've seen the downsides of certain innovations like, dare I say, televisions and cell phones and pesticides. And then there have been some landmark innovations like atomic energy, which have had world historic ethical and political debates attached to them. But I think our hope is that with synthetic biology, we will get some very useful products, medicines and fuels, for example, with very, very high benefits and very, very low risk. That's the hope. In the meantime, the public is going to be well served by a harmonious blend, I believe, of private initiative and investment, restrained by self-imposed professional standards and ethics, along with, secondly, public policies that nurture and reward the business of science as well as grassroots curiosity and achievement. So recommendation 10 calls for oversight and accountability. So technologies deriving from the new science necessarily will impact society, and as such, citizens and their leaders should have a voice in deciding the conditions and direction of research efforts. Scientists have responsibility to use public monies, and not just public monies, but to use the fruits of public investment, which they may not have directly received but are benefiting from, in a way that's consistent with the public trust. Those who work in the field of synthetic biology, from the hobbyist to the university researcher, to the global multinational corporation, have to be mindful of the risk that their work poses for human health, safety, and security. So everybody should be prepared to work with a degree of transparency and foresight and to respond appropriately in the event of accident or mistake. Like atomic science, synthetic biology must recognize the uncertain nature of risk associated with their efforts, and that they must be prepared to act cautiously and with utmost attention to the public interest. So again, recommendation 10 suggests the President, working with federal agencies, engage in oversight and in fostering accountability.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So I think this number 11 is a natural extension of the conversation that's been going on here. We're all very familiar with the culture of responsibility. It's in academic institutions and private companies, because most of them come from academia, as well as the federal government. They all understand the world that they work in. They all understand the ethical implications of the work that they do. And so the thing that makes SynBio a little bit unique is that it's been embraced by those outside of academia and outside of these private companies or the so-called DIY communities, which we, I think, should foster that sort of involvement and that curiosity, but in the same frame of reference also try to assure that these communities are also understand the ethical and the responsibility that goes along with what they're wanting to do. When you move the principle of intellectual freedom and responsibility away from the institution and into the individual, I think it becomes a lot more inherent upon the government to make sure that they are doing things in the correct way, or that we're performing enough vigilance and making sure that they are proceeding ethically and without any concern to the public, without trying to limit what their interests are or their research efforts. So to that end, there's various issues or various tracks that you could take. Barbara mentioned public education. I think this fits well into the President's strategy on countering biological threats, in which he embraced developing a culture of responsibility and ethics, both here at home and internationally. It has some sort of parallels with computer programming, where there's a lot of people that can do very effective computer programming, but you want to make sure that they're doing it in a very ethical environment as well. So that brings us up to number 11, which states the Executive Office of the President through the Office of the Science and Technology Policy, or a similar office, informed by the current work of the FBI, and the FBI has done tremendous work in this arena. We heard from the special agent in charge, and they've done it in a very collaborative environment. They haven't come down with a heavy hand. They've more embraced them and tried to come up with this as a partnership. But by the current work of the FBI and other departments should undertake a gap analysis to assess the specific risks of synthetic biology research activities in non-institutional settings, such as the DIY community. And if possible, the analysis should identify efforts to bring these communities into the ongoing culture of responsibility and local accountability that currently exists in many institutional settings. Legislation or other tools may be pursued, if needed, to guide and foster accountability within these communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And Barbara, I think you're on next. Number 12.
This is number 12 is actually a follow-up of both the last two, and really speaks to a little more than the private responsibility, but really looks to the oversight of the whole area. So in academics, I think we're used to a lot of oversight, as we've already talked about. We have institutional committees, we have peer review, we have NIH guidelines that have to be followed. But really, when you come to the SynBio people, they may not even understand that there are guidelines, much less know what they are. So that's really the piece in the last recommendation. Here, if we talk about companies, we come to a little bit different issue than not understanding. Many of the private companies and corporations currently have a lot of scrutiny. They're scrutinized by the USDA for animals and animal activities, the FDA They have to meet all the same standards for an FDA approval that anybody in academics would have to meet. They have OSHA looking at their safety of their employees and so on. So there are a lot of things that are like academics, but what they don't have is the regulations of the NIH guidelines and the things that NIH specifically requires of anybody that gets federal funding. And the issue is whether this whole area is becoming important enough and big enough that we should really be expecting everybody to follow the NIH guidelines as well as all the rest of the kinds of requirements. So Recommendation 12 says if the community or the capacity of independent and private researchers and companies and corporations continues to grow, the government should consider making compliance with certain oversight measures like the NIH guidelines for recombinant DNA or comparable safety standards mandatory for all researchers regardless of funding. Such a step may require new legislation or revisions to existing statutes or regulations. This issue should be considered by the Executive Office of the President or another designated office as part of the gap analysis described in Recommendation 11.
Barbara, thank you. And our fourth and final recommendation in the intellectual freedom and responsibility area, Nita is going to lead it.
One of the concerns that we heard most frequently from our discussions was the concern about the dual use application of emerging synthetic biology. So while there are tremendous benefits, and that's where we expect the direction of much of this research to go, there also is a possibility that such research could yield concern for malevolent use or for nefarious use of synthetic biology. So this includes concerns such as using novel pathogens or reviving existing pathogens and administering them to populations, or introducing things into water systems or ecosystems that might be quite destructive. Understanding that research happens at an international level and that restrictions that we place here may simply lead to researchers moving abroad or to research transferring abroad, we're mindful that there needs to be a balance between whatever restrictions we might wish to impose upon the export or import of different parts that would be used for synthetic biology, and understanding that there also is the need for research to progress, and that to the extent that we are a leader in synthetic biology, we don't wish to stymie any of that type of progress. We had a panel that was dedicated in our second meeting to biosecurity concerns, and I think it gave us all great comfort to know the level of coordination that's happening at an international level, particularly with respect to things like sequences that are being regulated in select agents, where rather than individual researchers being able to simply purchase such sequences, they are required to go through a checklist and look at things like whether they're on a list where they are permitted to buy such things. So recognizing that there is significant oversight already that is happening, that there's significant coordination happening at an international level, and also recognizing our principle of prudent vigilance, which is that we don't wish to stymie research or intellectual freedom, we come to recommendation number 13. So recommendation number 13 says that to promote intellectual freedom while protecting national security, the government, acting through the Department of Commerce, in coordination with relevant science and regulatory agencies such as the NIH and EPA, should continue to engage the scientific community in discussions and policymaking to ensure that export controls for security purposes do not restrain the free exchange of information and materials among the international scientific community. And I would just propose that we consider slightly broadening this. So in particular, rather than focusing exclusively on the export controls, I would encourage us also to think about import controls that likewise might be applicable. And then I wonder whether the Department of Commerce is the right direction or the right agency for us to direct our recommendation to, and maybe Alex could speak to this as to whether or not, given the national security concerns, we should be directing this more to something like the Department of Homeland Security or to DOD, or at least more broadly to include those agencies as well.
Alex, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So the Department of Commerce, of course, is the regulatory body for import and export controls. And so that's why I think rightly they were named in this. I do think, though, that the Department of Homeland Security should partner with the Department of Commerce in the national security issues that revolve around import and export control, and however we can fashion that into the statement, I think would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think we should probably put that in the text. The Department of Commerce is the right, it will be the body that determines this, and I and other leaders in higher education have had experience with the issue of export controls, and when there is a report issued, it's definitely the Department of Commerce that makes the final determination, but we can certainly put in the text as to what other bodies need to be consulted in that.
So where we say in coordination with relevant science and regulatory agencies, that's where, rather than just limiting to things like NIH and EPA, I would suggest that we broaden it to consider, given that we're making it a national security balance, that we included in that part.
I agree.
Good.
How do you feel, again, with the one you presented, Nita, where we talk about we not want to unduly restrain the free exchange of information and materials? Are we explicit enough, not for my comfort, maybe just for everyone else's comfort, are we explicit enough about the notion that so much of what is valuable is data, that these much of what the innovation, much of innovation that may come will be around gene sequences, which will be stored as nothing more than data? Is it redundant or not ill-advised to talk about information, data, and materials? I realize data is a form of information, but in this case, data is a form of the material. It really is the material of the science.
So I know that this has been a concern of mine and many of ours about the fact that so much information, for example, pathogens which no longer are in circulation are now simply posted on the internet and widely available. But I think we also heard that it's really difficult to try to restrain that type of information, and that for us to try to restrain that information would be rather fruitless. I mean, looking at something like WikiLeaks, I would imagine that within a few days.
In fact, this section is talking about ensuring that we don't restrain it. That's why I was calling it out.
Right. So I'm saying, given I think that context, I think it's appropriate for us to not try to restrain it, given everything that we heard and the understanding that it's so difficult to do. Instead, if we're thinking about things like export controls, and I would suggest also potentially import controls about at least identified select agents and at least identified sequences, that may be something that we can more likely track, but to actually restrict it seems relatively difficult.
The reason I want to call out not to restrict it is in part because for many of our university workers in laboratories, export controls, just the phrase, sends a chill up their spine because of I was trying to think of a non-pejorative descriptive word, events of not too many years ago when even students in our labs were deemed as, when they called deemed export, were deemed as exports because they carried in their head information. So, well, it's the truth.
So are you suggesting we make this more specific as to specifically what we mean with respect
well,
to
except, I'm just trying to, yes, I'm trying to cover, the last phrase is saying that we do not want to see restrictions, and I'm trying to suggest that data should be in the not restricted area along with the general categories of information.
So I'm reading this a little bit differently, perhaps. I'm not reading this to say that we do not restrain it at all. I'm reading it to say that we're balancing to make sure that export controls for security purposes do not unduly restrain the free exchange of information and materials among the international scientific community. So I'm reading that to say we think we don't wish to overly restrain such free exchange and yet recognize that some oversight is appropriate.
So I think the concern, if I could zero in on Jim's concern, may be lumping together information and materials in one phrase. The free exchange of materials is both, even if you are agnostic about how desirable it is to restrain it, and I'm not, I think it's undesirable to restrain it, but even if you think it might be desirable to restrain it, you cannot in this day and age. There will be free exchange of materials in this domain. That's different from high security information, which originates in a security realm. We're talking about information here that comes out of scientists' labs. So I think we need to make sure we distinguish in some way between information, pure information, and materials. It's going to be impossible to restrain, and it would be undesirable as well. But I think there we can be a little bit clearer that we're really focusing largely on the products of science here for export controls rather than information per se.
In the spirit,
and there'll be gray areas for sure, but as I like to tell my students who say, well, if there are these hard cases, how can you have this distinction? Well, there's dusk and dawn, but that doesn't prevent us from knowing that there's day and night. And there's some information in the science realm that really this principle of intellectual freedom and responsibility is meant to say. We've really got to enable that to be freely exchanged, even though there are downside risks there.
I agree that we do not want to restrain information, particularly the way in which we're characterizing it here. Nevertheless, I think we're going to need to be much more specific as to what we mean by materials then, given that this area, materials, can be something as simple as oligonucleotides or the directions on how to synthesize something.
The directions is information.
But remember, we're not saying that materials should be restrained. We're saying that they...
Well, we understand that they are restrained.
Yeah,
right? So there are some restraints, at least for select agents, not down to the reagent level or not down to the oligonucleotide level, but at least for certain...
Let me go a little further. How comfortable are we with saying, even cautioning about the restraint of knowledge in these areas? Again, I'm cautious about that era, and some of you were doing lab work at that time, where you couldn't invite a Pakistani student into your laboratory if a particular activity was one that was considered to be related to national security. Is knowledge too broad a word to caution against restricting?
Perhaps. I guess I hear the concern and I agree with it. I'm wondering if we're trying to make this particular recommendation do too much work then.
Could be.
And I'm reading export controls here and intellectual freedom, the balance here, to pertain, particularly given the discussion that we have in earlier chapters about export controls for select agents and for products that we find. Products, again, this is a difficult language, but synthesizing particular sequences that we don't wish exported. So if that's what this is about, that we find that to be permissible, we don't want to disturb that, and yet recognize that we don't want to unduly restrict academic freedom, a second, perhaps strong statement could reflect this concern.
But maybe then we need to define what we want to restrict and define what the rest is, because I do agree there are things that we need to restrict, but I really think the whole export control was ill thought out at the time and has not done us a favor. So
it was resolved in a good way, and I think
yes,
in a way that
true.
this recommendation builds on. Okay. This recommendation should focus, and if we haven't worded it exactly right, we should word it. But I think the way Nita read it, it's correctly worded. It's not incorrect. But it's really focused on the fact that it works best when the scientific community is consulted. And this recommendation says that
continue to engage the scientific.
That the legislative bodies, the bodies that have the regulatory bodies, but they're the ones who in fact write the regs here. They should continue to consult with the scientific community in all instances. And as long as there's the emphasis on that, that's the way the real controversy over deemed export controls was resolved, which it was determined that since there weren't actual cases of threat that were at issue, but potential cases, that there ought to be a scientific panel or group that would be consulted in any case that came up to resolve the issue. And that was a very good resolution at the time, and I know that many of the people who were involved in that, and I thought it came out well. The process leading to that, I think we could make much more effective and have less angst involved because we've learned from the mistakes that were made leading up to that conclusion. But I think as you worded this recommendation, I think it says the right thing.
Comments on some of the other
Yeah.
recommendations in this section? Nelson.
More just a practical point is, and this is something that came up in our discussions this morning, as if I recall, I think it was your comment, that we can put into place mechanisms so people who aren't traditionally involved in biomedical research, like do-it-yourselfers, can get access to guidelines. So they're aware, and if regulation was to be put into place, that they could become compliant. But it's a kind of a bewildering system if you're not inculcated and not trained in bioethics to know where your entry point is. So, we had a discussion about some sort of user-friendly portal. So someone who's working in their garage, if they're now having to comply with these regulations, at least can do their due diligence fairly simply, because I think you rightfully said that, if I remember your comments, that in the absence of that, even people with good intentions are likely just to give up because it's too hard to do.
Exactly right, yeah. Well, do we want to reflect something like that in here?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because
it needs to be if we're trying to do, as this one says, develop further an ongoing cultural responsibility to provide, I like your word portal, a place to do that. Yeah, so maybe we ought to consider crafting something of a recommendation along those lines.
Or just put it in this way.
Yeah.
Make it specific.
Yeah. Make it specific here. Nita?
So we discussed this a little bit earlier, but the way that we've worded 10 and 11 right now suggests that we need to do a gap analysis for the specific risks of synthetic biology in non-institutional settings. I think we likewise should word number 10 to make clear that where we say the government should evaluate current oversight mechanisms to assess their effectiveness and determine what steps should be taken, that we're likewise suggesting an overall gap analysis, not just with respect to do-it-yourselfers, and we're not singling out the do-it-yourselfers with respect to gap analysis.
I think so. That's right.
Does everybody here agree with that? Because I think that's an important revision that we should integrate.
Yeah,
Good.
I agree. Other thoughts, comments on this set? Now remember, we've been talking in the context of intellectual freedom. I imagine if somebody attended only this session and none of the others, they might imagine that we were somehow less concerned than we should be about responsible stewardship, for example. But in the context, I think in the context of this particular principle, all of our conversation comments are well received. Thoughts from the group? Yes, please come to the microphone and let us know who you are.
Take this microphone. Hi. I'm Stephanie Ramage with the Sunday Paper. It's here in Atlanta. And I confess, I missed some of the stuff this morning, so you could have given this already. But I noticed there's a lot of concern about maybe the DIY practitioners. And there's been so much concern about it that I'm afraid that I might misconstrue or perhaps miscommunicate the heft that they have in this community. How many people are we talking about exactly? How many DIY practitioners might there be? Has anyone looked into that?
We had a very good presentation on that, and I'm trying to recall. It's surprisingly large. The comments you might have missed this morning, we were talking about the importance of recognizing that you can't arrest research. We even talked about the perils of arresting research, and we even talked about the nuclear industry as an example, and then a very good point being made that unlike some of that kind of science, the science associated with synthetic biology, parts anyway, the science associated with synthetic biology can happen in people's garages, can take place. Oh, Dan, I'm sorry.
We do have a cited estimate in our report of 2,000 people belonging to this informal
Good
network
catch.
called
Good
DIY Bio.
You're on.
So I think it's important to say where the DIY community, do-it-yourself community is within the larger context, as you asked. And it is one of the distinguishing features of synthetic biology. It's not the only field in science and engineering, but it's one of the fields that you can do in your garage, much the way there were chemistry kits that I had as a kid that I could do in my home, and they weren't without some risk. They probably had greater risk right now than the do-it-yourselfers have with regard to synthetic biology as far as biosafety. In the larger context of what brings us to study synthetic biology, all the scientists we spoke to agreed that what you can do in your garage now with regard to synthetic biology is very elementary, even compared to what synthetic biology now has accomplished in its infancy or adolescence as a relatively new field. So there's not even close to what the synthesized genome is, which is a very simple organism that the Venter Institute created, or what Jay Kiesling is doing with regard to a malaria drug. What is wonderful about the do-it-yourself community is it has spurred interest in a burgeoning field of synthetic biology. What we're doing as a commission is looking proactively as a way of getting that community educated in the same way that other practitioners of synthetic biology are. But for those people who are, if there are people who are panicked about what would happen in a garage today with regard to synthetic biology, I would say what we've learned is there's no cause for panic today, that what we really want to do is look forward to make sure that the 2,000 plus members of the do-it-yourself community are what Drew Endy said he would like to see more DIT, become into a DIT community, a do-it-together community, in the sense that at least online and in some there's some loose organization of people who are seriously involved in synthetic biology in their garages.
Barbara, did you have a comment on
that? Exactly that.
That was a point you were going to make?
Could I just, I think maybe if I could kind of try to summarize, Amy, what you just said very nicely, for the purposes of our questioner, there are sort of three unique challenges that the do-it-yourselfers pose. One is a challenge to traditional government regulation and models of government regulation. The second is a challenge to traditional mainstream bioethics, because it's a question of access to education. And then thirdly, it's a challenge to traditional intellectual property conceptions, because we see a more freewheeling and less reverent group who's not necessarily bounded by traditional notions of copyright and trademark and patent. So those three challenges, I think, have made this a very interesting and important topic for us to deliberate about.
Christine?
I just wanted to add to that. I think what has struck me as not only one of the riches of synthetic biology, but also something that's a challenge, is in addition to the do-it-yourself community, synthetic biology brings together disciplines that have traditionally not worked together, and that have sometimes, maybe often, different cultures in terms of how they do their work. And so that's an interesting challenge in terms of the big picture of synthetic biology that takes in much more than just the do-it-yourselfers.
I think as far as research goes, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Are we open for other questions?
Yeah, are we done with this question? Yes. I want to take us back to number 12, where we call for considering the extension of oversight measures to all researchers, regardless of their funding source. We hear this sort of call from time to time with regard to standard research, clinical research. The objection is put that there's no reason why the federal regulations shouldn't be extended to everybody doing research on human subjects in this country. I think that's a powerful observation. But that hasn't happened, and I'm just wondering what are the impediments to that extension with regard to research in general, and could we expect the same sorts of impediments with regard to this call for synthetic biology being applied, regardless of funding source?
Barbara?
I'm not sure I have the complete answer, but I would just say that in human subjects research, there's at least enough control from the FDA to allow things to have to be done along the path. So even though there's not the same NIH guidelines, there's a lot of human subjects guidelines. Synthetic biology has this risk that's out there that we really don't know how bad it is, and that's really what makes this, to my mind, a little different. It's really an issue of managing a risk that might or might not be an important risk, but having at least an oversight while it's at this early stage.
I think we might want to add some language to that effect here, to distinguish this from the standard case of clinical research, showing why there might be more of a need for expanded oversight in this case.
Nita?
Building on John's point, I've discussed before thoughts about transparency and how it is that we could increase transparency in this particular field, and if there is a unique concern with respect to registering novel organisms or things like that. It seems like maybe this might be a place in which we could think about that. So we're saying we should consider making compliance with certain oversight measures like NIH guidelines or comparable safety standards mandatory. It may not just be oversight measures, but regulatory measures, including registration or disclosure requirements. And so, given that we already are recognizing that such a step may require new legislation or revision to existing statutes or regulations, this might be such a revision that we could consider as whether new mechanisms for disclosure to the government, disclosure in a limited capacity of novel organisms could be something that we recommend looking into.
How do people feel about that? That's obviously, maybe it's not. It would appear to me that disclosure or registration has unless it can be kept confidential and proprietary, has the risk of driving work underground. But if it can be kept proprietary, as we do around nuclear materials, for example, perhaps so. How does the Commission feel about that?
And that is the way in which I'm recommending it, is that it be something that still allows people to preserve trade secrets with strict confidentiality, simply allowing it for oversight, for tracking or surveillance purposes, as we already do with things like select agents or other particular nuclear materials.
You're on, Nelson.
Yeah, I'd say that if you could preserve the issues surrounding trade secrets, then I think that it's certainly laudable. And it sounds like there's extant exemplars for how it's worked in the past.
Interesting to hear from somebody on that. Yeah, Barbara.
I'm not sure, but I'd sort of take the other side, that I'm not sure it's needed, that this may be, it may be that we're talking about it because we don't know the risks, and that's why it might be needed. On the other hand, this is a field that's growing so fast, there's going to be so much registration of so much stuff that I can't imagine who's going to want to keep track of it in a while. So I guess I'm just not sure it really would do what we want it to do, and that what would somebody do if it's registered and they don't like it. I mean, it's not an easy issue to just think about registering something and keeping it confidential.
Nelson.
Well, then maybe you could take the approach that since we don't know, we wanted to gain knowledge, and there could be a pilot project that could ask whether or not that this would be feasible.
I mean, one of the things that I think we should not forget is how routine and ordinary it is for the federal government to collect data and then keep it secret for business reasons. I mean, companies have to give up vast quantities of sensitive data for compliance with the tax laws and the securities laws and the OSHA and employment laws. And the government is quite decent, actually, at keeping that stuff secret to respect business practice secrets, trade secrets, and so forth. So it wouldn't really be extraordinary if in this realm the government required some kind of registration or something else to protect human safety and well-being, while also having expectation they were going to keep sensitive information that was proprietary and secret. So it's just not an extraordinary thing at all to ask that of government or of the private sector, in my view.
That's a good point, but I'm still not sure who would do something with it. I mean, it's really what the practicality of it really is in my mind.
Well, except we have the foundries who are already doing some pre-screening, right?
That's true.
Of sequences.
And that's very deliberate right at the time when it's at use. It's not at a just in general level.
So there are three communities here that are the primary targets for a recommendation of this sort. One is already covered, the publicly funded community, and that's covered. That's not. The second are private organizations that are doing major research in this area, and their desire to get patents is going to go into registration, into a confidential registration, but late in the game. And so the question is, do we want registration earlier? The third community is the do-it-yourselfers, and they're not, at present, working on anything that would require registration at this point. Now, maybe sometime in the future there would be, and even if we recommended registration, that's just not going to happen. So it's really the second group that's the question.
And the second group may be broader than we think, Amy, right? Because it may include not just those who eventually will disclose through patent, but those who never have any intention of disclosing through patent because they have a financial incentive to keep it a trade secret. Says somebody living in Coca-Cola Town.
That's the real target here for a registry. Other than that, it doesn't have a target.
To that point, given that we recognize that this area of science is proceeding at great speed with private research funds, and it seems like more so than other research fields has a tremendous amount of private funding, and also potentially, given a small risk but high magnitude risk, a minimal thing like registration, we could limit what we're talking about, right? You don't need to register everything. You need to register anything that is a novel organism.
I'm agreeing, but saying you have to make it very narrow, because otherwise what this captures is the whole do-it-yourself community, which will be up in arms, and rightly so, of the idea that we're driving them underground because they now have to register everything that they think they're doing. So we should really make clear what the target area is that presents potentially enough risk that it's worthwhile considering registering. I think this is well worded, this recommendation, because it says we're recommending that it be considered for, and if we add the registration,
it too could be considered. I don't think we've had enough expert testimony on the area, and maybe not enough expertise sitting here. Certainly is true, speaking for myself, to really come to a conclusion today on this. Okay. But I think you make a good point. We wouldn't have to if we recommend in here that it be considered.
We should just be
as a tool. As
we've been elsewhere, we should be specific about where our concern lies, and it's in this particular area.
But you could see a registry system having broader, if foundries would agree to accept work only from registered individuals, et cetera.
Can I make a comment?
Raju.
Oh, Raju, come on in. We welcome your comment.
Yes, thank you. I think it's we should be very careful about registries because, as we talked about in the earlier part of the report, it's very clear that this is a continuum of things, and there are lots of research efforts that might involve synthesis of small oligonucleotides that are important for synthetic biology, but it's not truly synthetic biology. And if we get into this requirement, it may turn out that essentially all of molecular biology it would be considered as synthetic biology. So we have to be careful about how we define and what it is that we are trying to prevent.
Raju, while we have you on speaking, could you say a little bit about Asilomar and how you see that? Because as a model of what the importance is of...
Asilomar was a meeting, of scientists, and towards the end of that regular scientific meeting, everybody wanted to talk about recombinant DNA technology and what its implications were, and at that time, there was very little information was available about the benefits and the risks that are associated with the recombinant DNA technology, and so But what it did was it really stimulated the Recombinant Advisory Committee at the NIH, and they were able to put together a series of guidelines that were adapted by the scientific community. And that Recombinant Advisory Committee still exists, and it periodically reviews all of those rules and regulations. And in some cases, they have eased the regulations in certain aspects, and in other cases, that they have tightened them, and they were able to continuously change them as the science has progressed.
Yeah, so there's a living element of that. Let's put this one. Let's decide how we're going to deal with this on the table, and then we got to go to a break. Is number 12 as listed sufficient? Do we want to add the suggestion when we say oversight measures like NIH guidelines, comparative safety standards? Do we want to include a phrase there on a potential registry as something to be considered? I don't think, as I said earlier, I don't believe as a body we're able to consider it thoroughly.
I would hate to see that specific instrument included in the report, even though I want to emphasize again that some such government involvement consistent with intellectual property is quite possible and doable. But I don't want to commit to a registry as such.
Do we want to put something in the text around this one that might do it and not change the recommendation?
So I guess there's a different way we could go, which is, so we say certain oversight measures like NIH guidelines or comparable safety standards. This isn't really a safety standard per se. So if we change what it is that we say these oversight measures are, this is something that potentially could be in the text, right? Maybe a registration requirement, something like that, but simply eliminate what our particular recommendations are in here. So say compliance with certain oversight measures, period. And then in the text,
mandatory to all researchers, regardless of funding.
Right. And then in the text, we include some of these recommendations, like potentially NIH guidelines, comparable safety guidelines, maybe registration, as a potential additional thing for studying. Because I agree, I don't have any particular knowledge as to whether that's an effective tool. It's just one that I think.
And the text rationale in the text may be the better place to address this.
Right.
How do people feel about the news?
Yeah.
Let's go with that. And let's take a break.
Okay.
And we'll return at 3:30.